Every civilization the compact ever cataloged eventually asked itself the same question. Not whether it would survive contact with something larger than itself, but what it would be willing to become in order to keep surviving. Most species answered that question by shrinking. They specialized, they organized, they agreed to be predictable, because predictable species lived longer inside a system built by older, stronger neighbors. It was a reasonable answer. It had worked for 11,000 years. Humanity was the first species in compact history to answer that question by refusing to answer it at all. There is a number that every species in the compact learns before it learns to speak. It is called the threshold. It measures how much a civilization is worth keeping alive, weighed against how much room it takes up in the galaxy. Below the threshold, a species is protected. Above it, a species becomes a candidate for what the compact calls redistribution. Humanity crossed the threshold in its 412th year of contact. Not because it had grown too powerful, because it had grown too loud, too fast, too inconvenient to ignore, and far too cheap to kill. The compact had run the numbers 11 times. 11 times the conclusion came back the same. Humanity was not a threat, it was a liability. A species that bred too quickly, argued too much, and refused to specialize the way a well-run galaxy expected its citizens to specialize. Every other race in the compact had chosen a lane 100,000 years ago and stayed in it. The Threll built ships. The Anurai grew food. The Ketvale handled diplomacy because no one trusted the Ketvale to build anything that wouldn't explode. Humans did all of it badly all at once, and somehow the sum was greater than any of the parts. That was the problem. Nobody could plan around a species that refused to be predictable, so the compact assessment fleet was sent not to conquer, not even to punish, but to run one final experiment. They called it a compliance audit. Everyone else in the room knew it by its real name. A controlled demonstration small enough to look defensible in the historical record, large enough to make the point permanently. Take one system, show the numbers. Let the rest of the species watching from a safe distance draw the correct conclusion. They chose the colony at Meridian Station, 400,000 souls on a terraformed moon that had taken 3 generations to become livable. It was far enough from Earth that a response would take weeks, close enough to matter. The audit fleet arrived on a Tuesday. By the local calendar, nobody in the compact bothered to check. 14 capital ships, each one larger than anything humanity had ever fielded, dropped out of transit space in a formation that had been chosen for its psychological effect as much as its tactical one. A wall of light in the sky, arranged to look inevitable. Commander Yeva Os watched it happen from Meridian's only orbital platform, a research station with 6 decks, 40 crew, and exactly 0 weapons capable of scratching the paint on a compact hull. She had 31 seconds of warning before the first ship cleared transit. She used 11 of them staring at the display, because some part of her brain that had evolved to run from large predators on an African savanna 200,000 years ago recognized, instantly and correctly, that this was the largest predator it had ever seen. Then she used the other 20 seconds doing the only thing that had ever mattered in moments like this. She started giving orders. The compact's opening transmission was almost gentle. A voice modulated to sound reasonable, explaining that Meridian Station was found to be in violation of distribution protocol, that the population had 6 hours to evacuate to designated transit points, and that any resistance would be regarded as confirmation of the audit's findings. The tone suggested this was a courtesy. It was not. It was theater, performed for an audience of every other species watching the broadcast from 1,000 light-years away, all of them wondering if this was the year the compact finally came for them too. Osai's answer went out 4 minutes later on every frequency the station could reach, including several the compact fleet was not expecting a colony that size to have. She did not ask for terms. She did not ask for time. She read them the names of the 400,000 people on the moon below her, all of them, every single one, in a voice that did not break, for as long as it took, because she had decided that if the compact was going to reduce her people to a number, they would at least have to sit there and listen to what the number actually was. It took 2 hours and 40 minutes. The compact fleet did not fire. Nobody in that formation had ever heard anything like it, and for the first time since the audit had been authorized, the officers running it began to understand they had made a mistake in their arithmetic, because a name is not a statistic. A name is a debt, and humans, more than any other species the compact had ever cataloged, had never once forgot what they owed each other. Down on Meridian, while Os read the list, the colony did not wait to be saved. There was no cavalry coming. Earth was 3 weeks away even at maximum burn, and everyone on that moon knew it. So they did what humans have always done when the math says the fight is unwinnable. They fought anyway, and they did it with whatever was in reach. Mining engineers rewired ore haulers into kinetic launchers, aiming raw iron slugs at anything that came low enough to threaten the surface. Farmers who had spent a decade coaxing crops out of alien soil turned their irrigation networks into makeshift electromagnetic disruptors, frying the sensor arrays on 3 separate compact drop shuttles before anyone upstairs even registered the interference. A retired schoolteacher named Marcus Webb, 61 years old, organized 400 civilians into a chain that moved emergency supplies through collapsing tunnels for 9 straight hours without a single person stopping to rest, because he had decided on his own authority that the count of the living was not going to drop on his watch. None of it was elegant. None of it was going to win a war against 14 capital ships. That was never the point. The point was that every single person in that colony had looked at odds that should have produced despair, and produced defiance instead, and the compact had no model for that. Their entire framework for predicting a species' behavior under existential threat assumed rational actors optimizing for individual survival. Humanity had never once in 400 years of contact behaved like a rational actor. They behaved like a family, and family does not run the numbers before deciding whether to help. By hour 3, something had shifted inside the compact command ship. Not sympathy. The compact did not do sympathy easily. Confusion, and beneath the confusion something closer to fear. The audit was supposed to demonstrate a clean clinical example of redistribution. Instead, every camera on every ship was recording 400,000 people who would not stop resisting, would not stop building, would not stop looking directly into the largest fleet most of them had ever seen, and simply refusing to accept the ending that fleet had been sent to write. The broadcast was being watched. That was the part the audit commanders had forgotten to account for. Every species in the compact had access to the feed because the whole exercise had been designed as a demonstration, and demonstrations run in both directions. The Anorai, gentle farmers who had never fielded a warship in their recorded history, watched humans defending a moon with irrigation pipes and old mining equipment, and something in their collective memory, some ancestral grief about a harvest they had once lost without a fight, began to stir. The Ketvale, diplomats by trade and temperament, watched a human commander read 400,000 names into an open channel rather than beg for mercy, and understood for the first time that they had spent 4 centuries mistaking humanity's noise for weakness, when it had always been the sound of a species that simply refused to let anyone go unmourned or unmissed. Even the Threll, the shipbuilders, the closest thing the compact had to a warrior caste, found themselves recalculating. Their engineers ran the numbers on what the colony's improvised defenses were accomplishing against compact-grade shielding, and the numbers did not make sense. The devices should not have worked. They were held together with civilian-grade components, built in hours by people with no military training, and yet compact shuttle after compact shuttle was being forced to abort its approach. The Threll had a phrase for technology that outperformed its specifications. They called it an anomaly requiring further study. What they meant, though none of them said it aloud in the command channel, was that they had just watched an unarmed civilian population fight a war fleet to a standstill using farm equipment and grief, and none of their models could explain why that had worked. In the tunnels beneath Meridian's primary settlement, none of that debate mattered. What mattered was the next hour and the hour after that. A 19-year-old maintenance tech named Priya Chundran had been 3 months into her first posting when the fleet arrived, trained to repair atmospheric scrubbers, not to fight anything. When a support strut buckled in Sector 7 and trapped 11 people behind a wall of collapsed rock, she did not wait for someone more qualified. She spent 6 hours cutting through reinforced alloy with a tool designed to trim irrigation pipe, stopping only when her hands could no longer close around the grip. And then she kept going anyway because 11 people on the other side of that wall were still breathing, and breathing people do not get left as a rounding error. She got all 11 out. 2 of them did not survive the transport to the med bay. She carried both of their names to Commander Osai personally, so they would not be missing from the list still being read into the open channel above her. That was the pattern the compact fleet could not process. Every hour should have worn the colony down. Every hour instead produced another story exactly like Priya's, multiplied across 400,000 people who had never met each other, who owed each other nothing on paper, and who behaved uniformly as if they owed each other everything. At hour 4, the audit fleet commander, a Threll officer named Karagus Vel who had authorized 11 prior redistributions without incident, gave the order to escalate. 2 capital ships broke formation and began a bombardment run on the colony's primary settlement, intending to end the demonstration decisively before the political cost of hesitation became unrecoverable. It was the last order Vel ever gave that anyone in the compact respected. Because in that same hour, 3 things happened that no audit model had predicted. The first was that Earth, 3 weeks away by conventional transit, was not actually 3 weeks away. Humanity had spent the previous decade quietly developing a folded space drive specifically because 400 years of contact with a compact that ran audits like this one had taught them not to trust anyone else's timeline for their own survival. The project had been buried under a dozen false names, funded out of 100 different budgets so no single line item would ever draw compact attention, and staffed by engineers who had been told from their very first day on the project that they were building something the species might never get to use. They built it anyway. Every prototype that failed, every test that ended in a hull breach or a dead instrument array, Every year that passed without a working drive to show for it, the team kept going, because somewhere in the back of every one of their minds was the same quiet certainty that had built the colony at Meridian in the first place. Sooner or later, humanity would need to move faster than anyone expected, and it would need to move for each other, not for glory and not for the record books. The drive was untested at fleet scale. It was also at that moment carrying 6 response cruisers directly into the Meridian system, 17 minutes out and closing. The second was that Commander Osa, having finished the list of names, was not finished speaking. She opened the channel one final time and did something the Compact had never once encountered in 4 centuries of contact protocol. She offered Karagus Vel a choice, not a threat, a choice. Stand his fleet down and Meridian would treat the audit as a mistake rather than an atrocity. Continue the bombardment, and every species watching the feed would witness exactly what kind of civilization the Compact had built its threshold to protect. The third thing was the simplest, and in the end the one that mattered most. The people of Meridian mid-bombardment still did not stop working. Rescue teams pulled survivors from collapsed shelters while shells were still falling. Nobody broke. Nobody ran. The schoolteacher Marcus Webb was found 3 days later still coordinating supply runs from a command post he had built out of a cargo container, having not slept in over 70 hours because he had made a promise to 400 civilians and intended to keep every word of it. When the 6 human cruisers dropped out of transit 17 minutes later, they did not need to fire a shot. Karagus Vel had already given the order to withdraw, not because he feared the cruisers, small as they were against his fleet, but because he had finally understood what every species watching the broadcast already knew. The audit had never been a test of humanity's military capability. It had been a test of whether humanity could be broken, and the answer delivered in real time to every corner of the Compact was no. Not by force, not by numbers, not by an arithmetic that had never once accounted for what people are willing to do for each other when nothing else is left. The Compact Council convened an emergency session 11 days later. The official record calls it a threshold review. The unofficial record, the one whispered in 100 different languages across 100 different worlds, calls it the day the galaxy stopped asking whether humanity deserved to exist, and started asking what it would take to have humanity on their side instead. The threshold itself was quietly redefined within the year. Population growth and resource consumption were no longer weighed as the sole predictors of a species' value. A new variable was added to the formula, one the Compact's own scientists struggled for months to properly quantify because it did not behave like any other variable in their models. They called it, in the driest possible translation, cohesion under loss. Humans call it something simpler. They call it not leaving anyone behind. Commander Yeva Osai never gave another speech about the audit. She did not need to. The recording of her reading 400,000 names into an open channel became the most translated piece of media in Compact history, played in classrooms on 40 different worlds, studied by species who had never once considered that a name could be a weapon. If the person speaking it refused to let it be forgotten, Marcus Webb went back to teaching. He kept for the rest of his life a small ledger with 400,000 names in it, copied out by hand over 11 years, one at a time, because he said a list on a screen could be deleted, and he wanted something that couldn't. And somewhere in the Compact's archives, filed under the audit that never finished, there is a single line added by an anonymous analyst who reviewed the Meridian footage more times than his supervisors ever knew about. It reads in translation as close as any translation can manage: "We measured them as a cost. We should have measured them as a promise. No one has ever broken one." The Compact learned that day what the rest of the galaxy would spend the next century relearning, one uneasy alliance at a time. Humanity was never going to be the largest fleet in any conflict, or the most advanced, or the easiest to predict. It was always going to be the one still standing at the end, not because it had won every fight, but because it had never once been willing to let the count of the living fall while there was still a name left to say. That is not a variable any threshold can measure. It never was. It is simply the thing humanity had been doing since long before anyone was watching, and the thing it kept doing once the entire galaxy finally was. In the years that followed, other species began sending observers to Earth, not as auditors but as students. They wanted to understand how a civilization that had never agreed on a single language, a single government, or a single vision of its own future had still managed to move as one body the moment it mattered. The answer they found was rarely satisfying to a Compact mind trained to look for policy, for law, for some central mechanism that could be copied and installed elsewhere. There was no mechanism. There was only the habit, practiced quietly for 100,000 years before anyone in the stars was watching, of showing up for each other when nothing else could be counted on. It could not be legislated into existence. It could only be built the way Meridian had built it, one name at a time. Karagus Vel resigned his commission within the month. He is remembered in the parts of the Compact willing to remember him honestly, not as the officer who ordered the bombardment, but as the first Compact commander in recorded history to look at the numbers and choose to stop trusting them. He spent the remainder of his career arguing, often alone, that the threshold had never measured the right thing. and that the day would come when every species in the compact would need to know what it felt like to be counted the way Meridian had been counted, before the count meant anything at all. Meridian Station was rebuilt within 3 years, its population larger than before the audit, its name carried now by every ship that passed through the system as something closer to a promise than a place. The colony kept one tradition from that day, unofficial, unlegislated, and unbreakable. On the anniversary of the audit, at the exact hour Commander Osa began to speak, the entire settlement goes quiet, and someone chosen each year by lottery reads the names again, all 400,000 of them. It takes 2 hours and 40 minutes, the same as it always has, and every single time the whole colony stops to listen. Because a name spoken once can be forgotten, but a name spoken every year on purpose by people who did not have to, becomes something the galaxy has no word for in any language but ours.